I'd like to begin by stating an assumption that I have. That assumption is that I can change an organization, and that if I can do it, you can do it too. Some of you know me as a retired sergeant from a very busy Bay Area police agency. I currently work for an organization that has a bit of dysfunction. Training wasn't very prioritized. It was kind of a good old boy network, in fact. So the plum assignments went to the friends of the people who were in charge. And we had new people coming in who essentially were going out and not doing a very good job for our organization. So I'd like to tell you a story about how I worked to change an organization. And this story has nothing to do with police work. The story is actually about umpiring, because the organization that I'm talking about, and the organization that I'm talking about changing, was the high school umpiring group that I work with. That's not me, that's a friend of mine. The job of umpiring is very much like the job that we do in police work. We wear a uniform, we take pride in it. We work as a team. In fact, when we walk out onto the baseball field, we know that there's two baseball teams there. We consider ourselves the third team, so we actually call ourselves the third team. We're actually the team that never loses. We like that. So we also have a rule book. This may sound familiar to us as police officers. We have to enforce the rule book. We have to make observations throughout the game and then immediately apply the rule book to whatever it is that we see. And we have to be prepared, after making any decision, to justify that decision very quickly, orally, with good conflict resolution skills. The job of umpiring is very much like being a police officer. So I've been doing it for about 20 years. I worked for an organization that was fairly stable for many years. We had the same president. He basically did things the same way every time, and he was a great storyteller, and he was the wise sage on the stage, and we all looked up to him, we all revered him. When it came to training, every year we do an umpire clinic, preparatory to the high school season starting. And the clinic is a 1 or 2 day training session for all of our umpires, including new umpires, and we train them the way that we want umpiring to be done in our organization. And the way that it was done about 10 years ago under the old regime was that the president would choose a group of guys who were friends of his who were good umpires, and he would kind of put together the clinic to talk about the things that he wanted to talk about and teach people the things that he wanted to talk about. He kind of gave some assignments to the people that he was considering trainers for that clinic, and then the trainers would kind of muddle through doing what they had always done on the field. If you want to call strikes, you do it this way. If you want to get from here to here, this is how you do it. If somebody comes out of the dugout to argue with you, this is how I deal with it, so this is how you should deal with it. And recognize that there was some issues with that. Eventually, that president decided to retire. He needed to because his hips were bad. And I moved into onto the board of our umpiring organization, and I became the vice president. And the vice president's role was to deal with training. So I took what was a fairly disorganized group of people who didn't really value training or know much about adult learning, and I decided that I needed to change the culture of our organization. So For this next slide, I'd like you to think about a Russian nesting doll. In your mind, you know what that is. It's the doll, and you take one out, and then you open it up, and another smaller one comes out, and another smaller one comes out. So I wanted to change the culture of our organization. But I knew that I couldn't just say, hey fellas, we need to change the culture of our organization, and it would happen. It doesn't work that way. In our organization, the culture was determined based on the behaviors that people had, how they responded to training, how they went out onto the field and did their job as an umpire on the high school baseball field, how they were willing to engage in our training program or not, whether they were willing to work on their own game or not. I may or may not have had some influence on their behaviors, but to be honest with you, they got to choose their behaviors, and I didn't really think that I could have much influence on that. The umpires have a certain level of capability. Not all of our umpires work at the varsity level. Some of our umpires work in the freshman level, and that's all the games that they get. Some of them can work in the JV level, and some of them can work JV and varsity games. So not everybody has the same capabilities. Sometimes speed on the field is important. Sometimes decision making is important. Sometimes being able to manage conflict is the key thing for whether or not you're a freshman umpire or a varsity umpire, because at the higher levels, those coaches take it pretty seriously, and they will get in your face, even at the high school level. I can't really change their capabilities necessarily directly by just addressing capabilities. They have a certain set of beliefs and values about the game and about training and teaching. So I realized that one of the things that I could do is I could take a group of people who saw themselves as umpires and believe that that was their primary role, and I might be able to change that belief to make them think of themselves as trainers or teachers who umpire. So instead of being umpires who teach, I wanted them to think about themselves and believe that they were teachers who umpire. So I really wanted to shift their values, because what I really wanted to do is I wanted to shift a group of trainers' identity. I wanted a group of people who actually saw themselves as teachers in our umpiring organization group. And what I needed to do was give them a mission. So what I did, and this took place, I think this started about 6-7 years ago. So I've been working on this for a while. What I did is I identified the mission, and that was that we needed to change our organization one person at a time by learning to value training, and that we needed to have a training group, a dedicated cadre of umpire trainers who saw themselves as teachers, who were there to teach the third team. So recognizing that there were some indicators, the history that I talked about in our culture, there were some work avoidance patterns. People came to the clinics and they either participated or they didn't. The trainers were kind of on-again, off-again trainers, recognizing that that was happening. I decided that I needed to, one, act politically. So for my position on the board, I began massaging this idea with the other members of the board, and I got some support. And then I was able to separate the training coordinator, the training position away from the vice presidency, because I didn't really want to become a president anyway. So I separated myself and created a whole new training director position on the board. We got somebody else to fill the vice president role, and I became a training director. So acting politically, that helped me to be able to orchestrate some conflict. Orchestrating some conflict created an adaptive culture where now our organization was in the mode of being able to do some adaptive work to change their identity and maybe even some beliefs and values, at least among the training staff that I was trying to develop. After having orchestrated some conflict and getting, one of the things that I did was I selected a group of trainers, people that I didn't necessarily want to have to be the best umpires in our group. They didn't have to be the best umpires in the group. They needed to be capable, qualified, respected people in our group. But what they really needed to be was the right people. They needed to be people who I knew could work in an environment where they could take on extra work, where I believed that they could change their beliefs and values and maybe take on the new identity of being a trainer, teacher, as well as being an umpire. So that created some conflict because who was chosen and who wasn't chosen created that adaptive environment where we could get some work done and I could keep moving forward. So I had to create some interventions because to change their identity, to change this group of 20 guys that I had, and I'm using the word guys because our group was all men at the time, to change their identity from umpire to teacher, I needed to make sure that they had the knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to move from umpire to teacher. We started holding meetings. I found out that they didn't know much about adult learning, so I taught them. Taught them about adult learning concepts. I taught them about Knowles' principles of adult learning. I taught them about Bloom's taxonomy. That raised the heat again, orchestrated some more conflict because they had no idea why I was teaching them about Bloom's taxonomy. It was actually fascinating to watch, but when they were uncomfortable, it continued that adaptive environment where we could get some work done to change some beliefs and values about their identity. My loyalties in this was to the organization itself. I wanted every umpire who walked out onto the field to feel confident in their abilities to manage conflict, to call a game, and be good at it, and not have too many people yelling at you because, like I said, umpiring is like police work. People will yell at you. So I wanted to make sure that everybody in the organization could get to the varsity level if it was possible. My purpose was to develop a training cadre that became leaders within the organization so that those who were not in the training program or were not designated trainers, people who were not in there could go and talk to them and know that they were getting the right answer. So one of the things that I emphasized was that we don't want to teach them what you do or what you do on the field or what you do on the field. We want to teach them as a group. This is what our organization teaches. Our organization is the Contra Costa Umpires Association, so CCUA. This is what CCUA teaches. In this situation, this is what CCUA wants you to do. And we had to get out of the I mindset of, well, this is what I would do. This is how I would do it. Doing that, I developed some leadership capacities. And we started having umpire trainers who basically were applying adult learning concepts to our organization. And when they began to value themselves as teachers and began to value education and training for what it was, the rest of the organization began to value the training because the training increased exponentially in the quality of the training. So it was actually fun. And as I said, I've been doing this now for about 6 or 7 years. So how does PBL come into it? PBL comes into it because every year, at the beginning of our preparation for the high school season, the high school season usually starts around February. So by about October, November, I have to think about this. I have to go through the ideas of what can I do this year and how can what do I know about where we've been? And I need to figure out what I need to learn, and I need to figure out what they need to learn. I need to solve that issue. And then I need to come up with a plan, and then I need to evaluate, and I do the evaluation throughout, but at the end of the year, I begin again. So that's how I used PBL to implement a value shift or a culture shift in our organization. We've gotten to the point now after 6 or 7 years that these umpires who were going out onto the field and they believed that their job was to call balls and strikes and safes and outs and fairs and fouls. Now, in this last rotation for our last season, which just ended a couple of months ago, I had umpire trainers who were writing curriculum, lesson plans for our clinic. So instead of having one guy having a group of people who were his friends develop the clinic, the umpires trainers themselves were actually writing, developing, creating new lesson plans, and then delivering them on the field. To me, that was a critical value shift in what their identity was. And so I would say that it is possible using the Dilts Change Model, which is the nesting dolls, and the adaptive leadership model, which there's a book called Leadership on the Line, you can find that. Using those things together, I was able to change our organization for the better. We now do have better training, we do have better umpires out on the field, and we do value, as a culture, as an organization, training in a totally different way than we did 10 years ago. And I would argue that if I can do it in that kind of an organization, you can do it in your organization. That's it. Thanks.